Thank you. Welcome back to the inquiry into Drug, Poison and Controlled Substance Amendment Regulation for Personal and Adult Use of Cannabis Bill 2023. Joining us for this session is members from the Drug Advisory Council of Australia. We have Mr. Cal Clare, former Chief Commissioner of Victoria Police, Mr. Peter Richardson, Ms. Jane Kronberg, Mr. Charlie Ryan and Dr. Karen Broadley. Welcome all. Before I continue, I'll just read some information to you regarding the evidence you're going to provide to us today. Let's do the evidence provided. All evidence taken is protected by parliamentary privilege as provided by the Constitution Act 1975 and further subject to the provision of the Legislative Council Standing Order. Therefore, the information you provide during this hearing is protected by law. You're protected against any action for what you say during this hearing. But if you go elsewhere and repeat the same thing, those comments may not be protected by this privilege. Inevitably false evidence or misleading of the committee may be considered contempt of Parliament. All evidence is being recorded. You provide the approved version of the transcript following the hearing. The transcript will ultimately be made public and posted to the committee website. Before I do myself, I will just quickly introduce our committee to you. Chung Lu, Chair. To my right, Mr. Michael Galea. Mr. Ali. Hi. Ms. Rachel Payne.
Hello.
And Mr. David Kelly-Shank. And also on Zoom, we have Dr. Renee Heath. Just for recording purposes, could you please state your full name and your position in an organisation with, please? Sir, Cal, will you start? State your full name and the organisation.
My name is Kelvin Blair. I'm sorry, I'm quite deaf. What else did you want from me?
Just recording purposes, state your full name and the organisation.
Full name and organisation.
Just to the full recording.
I'm the chair of the Community Advocacy Alliance, and I have been associated with the Drug Advisory Council of Australia.
Chair, I believe you've already introduced and mentioned their names.
Oh.
I believe that might be
Jan, you want to
sufficient.
introduce each person's name?
Kel Clare, OA, OPM, former Chief Commissioner of Victoria Police, a supporter of DACA and the chair of the Community Advocacy Alliance. Peter Richardson, a director of DACA and a former member of Victoria Police. Myself, Jane Kronberg, and I'm the National President of the Drug Advisory Council. We call ourselves DACA. Charlie Ryan is one of our youth ambassadors at DACA, and Dr. Karen Broadley is a member of our executive team at DACA.
Thank you. Welcome. I know we've got a submission. I do invite you to have opening statement. Just due to the time, we'd like to ask you some questions. Could you give your statement short and brief to the point?
Trung, thank you very much. We understand we have about 10 minutes, and each person has prepared an address in accordance with that time frame. So we'll do our best. We might have the odd cough, but we'll do our best.
No problem.
So, my name's Janice Susan Kronberg, National President of the Drug Advisory Council of Australia Limited, DACA. As a former member for Eastern Metropolitan Region, I served in this Parliament from 2006 to 2014. With me are DACA's Dr. Karen Broadley, Director Peter Richardson, Youth Ambassador Charlie Ryan, and DACA's supporter Kel Clare, AO APM, former Chief Commissioner of Victoria Police. We are strongly opposed to the proposed legislation, as are our coalition partners in the Task Force for Drug Prevention and our affiliates worldwide. We say that this proposition is extremely dangerous, but not surprising, as it follows the standard pattern of those pushing to legalise illicit drugs, firstly to trivialise the harms, then to move to normalise their use through a type of lingua franca, everyone's using, what's wrong with you, and then to push for full-blown legalisation. What is incomprehensible is that such proponents blithely, totally ignore the harms of cannabis. Should this government ever succumb to the siren song of their push, particularly in the light of the vast array of mental and physical health risks, we would be failing to advance, protect and promote the human rights of its people. A government failing in its obligations to create all conditions necessary to enable the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health of its population. This is quoting Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Therefore, this inquiry represents an inflection point for all concerned. The harms of cannabis sativa include psychosis, schizophrenia, suicides, severe lung damage like marijuana lung and vanishing lung, cancers, especially testicular, brain damage, neonatal exposure leading to developmental and neurological disorders, premature births, opioid abuse, motor vehicle and workplace accidents, cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, the potentially fatal form of retching and vomiting cannabis use disorder. Cannabis causes harmful drug and medicine interactions and the risks of poisons through the ingestion of edibles. Recently, a retired police officer highlighted that in South Australia, individuals growing a cannabis plant for personal use were overseen by a notorious criminal organisation in their micro grow houses. The crops there were harvested and sold by the criminal organisation in South Australia. Now, those proposed 6 fat, 5 metre tall plants would yield a very large crop for personal use. This would inevitably attract a similar criminal regimen. In the US, grow houses, the conversion of the plant to oils, extract, dab, shatter or butter involves the use of highly inflammable butane lighter fluid. This has led to explosions, house fires and serious injuries. A 6th of February 2025 report from the University of Colorado School of Medicine study, coupled with a decades-long longitudinal research from New Zealand, the regular use threshold of 4+ days per week and a lifetime exposure of over 1,000 uses threshold indicates significant cannabis-related irreversible cognitive impairment, revealing a 5.5% IQ decline. The bill's proponents now need to face an uncomfortable truth. The increasing availability also creates a cognitive time bomb. I'm going to invite Dr. Karen Broadley.
Thank you. My name is Karen Broadley and my professional background includes a decade working with young people involved in the Victorian youth justice system and another decade working in child protection. These experiences led me to undertake a PhD and to an interest in evidence-informed legislation, policy and practice. I remember when I first met our DACA president, Mrs. Jan Kronberg, I did not have strong views about whether or not cannabis should be legalised. But I was very interested in what the evidence had to say. After doing a literature search, I can honestly say I was astounded by the enormous amount of research in the form of very recent systematic reviews, finding that cannabis use significantly harms human health. Cannabis use, for example, heightens the risk of psychiatric disorders, cardiovascular conditions, gastrointestinal disorders, and lung and other cancers. It has been shown to be associated with IQ decline. These findings are not controversial. Recent systematic reviews have also found that following recreational cannabis legalisation, there has been an increase in cannabis use and cannabis use disorder. I wish to emphasise how important it is to prioritise evidence in the form of systematic reviews. Please be sceptical of so-called experts who cherry-pick single studies, particularly outdated single studies, to support their point of view. Finally, I draw attention to the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Legislation Committee, which just last year recommended the Senate not pass the Legalising Cannabis Bill 2023, which had been introduced by Senator David Shoebridge from the Greens. The The bill failed mainly because the committee was concerned about the multiple ways legislation would harm public health. The committee was concerned, as are we, that legalisation would cause more harms and problems than the bill was aiming to resolve. Thank you.
Next person is Peter Richardson.
My name is Peter Richardson. I'm a board member of DACA, an ex-Vic Poll member and the stepfather of two women who have been forever damaged by their personal use of drugs, including cannabis. One is still in the depths of addiction and, to be blunt, is unlikely to survive it. DACA is trying to stop individuals and families having to endure what mine has. Surely broader society and our lawmakers should be helping in our efforts instead of encouraging and enabling our youth to go down this grim path. I know we can't eliminate the use of cannabis, but with education and enforcement of the laws that are currently in place but not enforced, we can reduce the number of users and accordingly reduce harm. The pro-drug lobby will tell you that cannabis isn't a gateway drug, but there is plenty of evidence it is, including a study from America's National Institutes of Health, which states that nearly half of regular cannabis users go on to use other illicit drugs. For those of you on the committee that sit on the fence on this debate, what is your gut saying? Mine is saying this bill is a gateway bill to the decriminalisation and ultimate legalisation of cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine and more. Thank you.
Charlie Ryan.
Good afternoon. My name is Charlie Darcy Ryan. I'm 17 and I'm appearing before you with the interest of safeguarding my generation's future. Legalising cannabis will not be a step toward freedom, but a march toward an age of an anxious dependency. Do not deceive yourselves. If alcohol laws cannot shield minors from drinking, cannabis laws will barely spare them from addiction. I have seen it with my own eyes. Classmates, barely 14, dealing cannabis. At 15-year-olds' birthday parties, young people falling to this supposed cultural rite of passage. If you make it legal, you certainly do not make it safe. You make it omnipresent, and you make it dangerously more available to underage Australians. In the vestibule of this parliament it says, "Where no council is, the people fall, but in the multitude of councillors there is safety." As councillors of the people, stand strong in that sacred duty, and please, safeguard the health of my generation's present and future lives. Thank you.
Kel Blair.
Thank you. My name's Kelvin Blair, commonly known as Kel. I'm a former Chief Commissioner of the Victoria Police. The amendments proposed to the Act by this bill are a recipe for disaster disguised as promoting human rights. Australia is a signatory to the United Nations Article 61 Convention on Narcotic Drugs and has an obligation to comply with that treaty. Human rights are not excuse for allowing any conduct that unreasonably harms anyone. That is why acts of violence and many other behaviours are prohibited by law. No society can exist in a state of anarchy. The scientific evidence that cannabis use is harmful to people is irrefutable. That cannabis use impacts on the capacity of our health system in a variety of ways is obvious. Authorising any households to grow up to 6 cannabis plants for personal use by people over 18 years of age and expecting no adverse outcomes for younger people is naivety bordering on lunacy. Where households have children under 18, it is certain that too many will be tempted to try what they see adults using frequently and freely. Escalation of young people using cannabis is a certainty, and to deny that is stupidity. The argument that people are being jailed for possession of small amounts of cannabis is disingenuous. As the person who created the Police Prosecutions Division and prosecuted and ran that division for over 3 years and who prosecuted literally thousands of cases in the magistrates' courts over an 18-year period, I can say that I know of no one who's been jailed for possession of a small amount of cannabis, and in fact Section 3 of the Act stipulates a maximum penalty of a fine of 5 penalty units, which is currently about $960. Time, effort and money would be better spent on education programs, particularly for young people, to inform of the dangers of using cannabis and other illicit drugs. Educating juveniles from an early age is a prerequisite to a lasting diminution in the use of illicit drugs that have become such a scourge on society. Public campaigns against drink driving and smoking tobacco have had real success. Alcohol abuse and tobacco have created more than enough health problems. Why would we wish to sanction another product capable of doing so much more harm to individuals and society? This bill must fail. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for keeping the statement brief, so give us time to committee to ask you questions. I'll start off, then I'll open up to the committee. Just to listen to this bill, we have made very close comparison to what's been legalised in ACT, and it has. I know it's been a short period of time that has been legalised in ACT, and we've drawn much comparison in relation to what has happened once legalised, and have been evidence that there's been little increase in usage in ACT, and it's a little increase in relation to hospital admissions. Now, I just want to refer to your submission that you have made some reference to other jurisdiction which has legalised cannabis, and I noticed that you draw your submission to Canada, which is legalised in 2018, and in America, in America you draw it legalised in Canada. It is also legalised in 2012. Just from those two jurisdictions, could you make some comparisons to listen to what has happened in those two countries? Listen to after being legalised, like any effects, any increase in using cannabis, any harm to the youth, the effect of cannabis into the youth populations. Because if you've drawn both in your submission in relation to the increased provision in cannabis in use in young adults in hospital attendance, so can you comment on those two jurisdictions that you have made in your submission?
Chair, I'm happy to answer that at length, but I'll just refer to Dr. Broadley, whose erudite research has brought that to bear in
Does anyone on the panel?
our report.
Okay. Look, I'll just briefly say, look, we did look at Canada, you're right, where it was legalised in 2018, and it's systematic reviews. There's a few systematic reviews there, and it takes a little while for the evidence to come out. But certainly in the 5 years since legalisation, there's been an increase in prevalence in cannabis use amongst young adults, adult hospital attendance for psychiatric distress and vomiting, and one that's really concerning, I mean they're all concerning, but unintentional ingestion of edible cannabis products by children, and that's something that's come out quite often in Canada and Colorado, and in the research with children eating cookies and eating other edibles and being taken to hospital. Yeah.
Was any data drawn from those two jurisdictions in relation to increase of usage of cannabis after being legalised? The number of cannabis being used, or in regard also in relation to other incidents in relation to cannabis consumptions?
Certainly there's an increase in cannabis consumption, and concerningly, two of the areas where there really has been an increase is in relation to young people, and also, interestingly, women who are pregnant. There's been an increase there, and I think and some research would suggest that some of that is because they get morning sickness, they have, pain or health issues through their pregnancy, and they think that the cannabis use in the form of medical cannabis will actually help alleviate those problems. But the problem is there's, again, systematic reviews that have shown how cannabis use during pregnancy impacts the health of the newborn in terms of, preterm birth and underweight, and just risks in terms of not surviving beyond the first few months of life.
Yeah, I understand you might have data with you now. I was wondering, when you draw from this research and this information, would you have data supporting these submissions as well?
The data. Oh,
Yeah.
look, in the submission that we made, we referred to systematic reviews, and they're all in the references. And for the most part, the links are there as well, and they're freely available. So if you've got any problems accessing the links, we're happy to provide the links. But yeah, there's a lot of systematic reviews there. And even interestingly, I found one systematic review of systematic reviews. There's so much research out there. And so the best way to find the evidence is really to go to a systematic review where authors, usually a number of authors, actually work to collect and review and collate and synthesise that research, and they do it in a very systematic way that is actually, you can reproduce that because they name their search terms and the dates that they search between and so on.
Thank you. I
Chair,
just
if I
want time
might
to
make
pass
a-
on to Malcolm.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much all for joining us. I'll start with you, Ms Kronberg. Feel free to pass to anyone else as you wish. In your submission, you've acknowledged that the review into the decriminalisation approach in the ACT found little to no concerns, but you have gone into great detail, and as we were just talking about, with some overseas examples, you cited Canada and Colorado in particular. The bill before us today, though, is for the decriminalisation model that's based on the ACT. So do you accept that decriminalisation is a better approach than full legalisation?
No.
No.
I don't want to see anything that is driving a wedge into the science that says that it's dangerous, no matter which way you actually pose an angle for leverage and influence and diminution of all of the public knowledge of the harms. And I just want to say something about the situation in the ACT. I have quite strong views about what is happening to the people of the ACT. I think in time to come, because it's an experimental site, and I think people are being treated as if they're living in a petri dish. So the people, I believe, once the manifestation of what's actually happening to them in this experimental setting, and then that in that small population, it is then put forward to be unleashed in larger population
Just to
settings.
stop you there, though, it has been in force now for more than 5 years, and your own submission acknowledges that, in your words, that there's little to no concerns.
Well, there's worse to come.
There's worse to come. I say, have you read the what's it called, the Lambert Initiative report that was released a couple of weeks ago?
No,
which-
not yet.
Not yet. Yeah, it has been a very, very recent publication. Section 5 of your submission, you've drawn a comparison between a majority of Victorians supporting cannabis, or the relaxation of cannabis laws, with white people supporting slavery centuries ago. Now, forgive me, but that's a triumph for absurdity, isn't it? To draw that comparison between slavery and cannabis.
Actually, Dr. Broadley feels very strongly about that issue.
Sure,
I'll
I'd be very
let
happy
her-
to hear your thoughts on that. I'm just curious because we actually haven't had many other submissions talk about public consensus, so you're one of the few that have brought this up, and the only argument that you've made is by drawing a comparison to slavery, so I'm not quite
Yes,
sure.
it's the reference to the ordinary person. Ordinary people believe that,
Yeah.
that term, yes?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Ms Broadley,
yeah.
sorry, Dr Broadley, would you like to?
Exactly. It's drawing, look, you might argue a fairly extreme. It's making a
On the
fairly
face of it, I
extreme
would say so,
example.
so that's why I'm keen to hear. Yeah.
But the point is about we can't really use what the ordinary person thinks is a good idea as, well, that means it's a good idea. Because the vast majority of people think it's a good idea, doesn't make it a good idea. We actually need to look at the evidence, and we need to scrutinise the evidence and question what is acceptable in our time, because as time moves on, we can look back in history and say, well, why did we all think that? Why did we all think it was a good idea to remove children because they're Indigenous? Why did we think this? Why did we think that? People did it unthinkingly at the time, but I just think we need to go way beyond just saying, well, because most people think this is a good idea, that makes it a good idea.
Sure, thank you. Sorry, I am limited with time, so I'm going to keep going as fast as I can. But Mr. Glare, I did want to actually ask you. You've painted quite a strong negative picture of what decriminalisation would look like if it were implemented in Victoria. Do you accept the results that show that in the ACT it hasn't led to more people taking up cannabis and it hasn't led to a higher instance of, for example, emergency room presentations?
I think it's too early to make that judgment. I don't think that it's possible at this stage to make that judgment. But common sense, I think, tells me that if someone's got 6, maybe 5 metre tall cannabis plants growing in their yard and there are children under 18, that and the adults in the house are using, that kids won't, try and see what it's like. It just seems to me absolutely ludicrous to think that they won't access that plant.
Thank you. Just while I've got you, Mr. Blair, you also talk about the road toll. Now, I would have thought common sense would also say that decriminalising cannabis would lead to more people driving under the influence. We actually know from the ACT that despite an increase in their roadside testing, they actually found 7% less incidence of people driving with cannabis. Would that change your opinions on the road toll
There can
arguments
be
that you make?
absolutely no doubt, and I think anyone who uses cannabis would agree that it alters their perceptions, it alters their reaction times.
I would agree with you, but in the
Now, you might
ACT
be
they
happy to
found
drive
less
100
people using.
kilometres an hour one direction or someone on cannabis driving 100 kilometres an hour the other. I'm not. I think that's unnecessary risk. The road toll, if I can, I've been to Holland 7 times. I have a very good friend responsible for all the senior education of police in the whole of Holland. And I asked him about the road toll because, as everyone knows, they've had a very lax approach to drugs. I asked him about the road toll and he said, it's horrendous. And I said, how many people involved in those fatalities are affected by cannabis and other illicit drugs? He said, no idea, we don't test. So if you don't look, you don't find. Failure to find is often failure to look.
And I take on board your point in particular about, I certainly agree with you that I don't want people under the influence of anything driving cars at 100 kilometres per hour. But the evidence from the ACT shows that following decriminalisation, there was actually a 7% decrease in the amount of people caught driving, despite roadside testing going up. Sorry,
I don't have the data on how often they test. It may be there's a reduced amount.
Well, the
of
ACT
testing.
policing themselves have told us there was a 17% increase, and at the same time a concurrent 7% decrease in cannabis affected drivers that they found. So, would that affect your opinion?
No, because I am horrified
the evidence from the
with the
ACT.
idea of people driving while affected by cannabis.
I think we agree on that, but I just want to get to the point of
I've seen
what the data actually shows, how the best way to reduce that is, and what we're seeing from the ACT probably isn't the common sense answer that I would have expected. So I was wanted to test that with you. Thank you.
I've attended some horrendous collisions and whatever, and I've seen hundreds and hundreds of bodies in the mortuary over a period. Everyone thinks they're better at driving than they are when they're not affected by anything, let alone when they're affected by some
Certainly
substance.
agree with you there.
And that goes for prescription drugs as well.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I see enormous dangers in this, but I'm more concerned. I'm very concerned about that, but I'm very concerned about the kids in these houses who have an example set for them by adults in the house of constant use of cannabis, and it must have an impact on them. Kids learn by example. They see what other people are doing. They see what the adults in the house are doing. They are more likely to follow that. And I think the evidence is absolutely clear that continued use of cannabis is harmful, particularly for young people. So I'm very concerned about that aspect.
Thank you.
Peter, do you want to?
Yeah, I'd like to address exactly your question, and
Yeah.
that is, and having been a tester of drugs, etc., those figures make absolutely no sense at all. There's no logic to the tests, the less positive tests when supposedly more people certainly have access to using marijuana.
I agree.
So
How do
it
you explain
makes
that?
no sense that so it's about who's testing. The fact is, I could test who I wanted to test while I was out there. Now, if people
Sorry, are you
want
saying
certain,
that the ACT policing division have been selectively doing roadside testing? That's a serious
well,
allegation.
we all do selective. That it is selective. It's not So when you pull up a car on the street, you test for alcohol. You have a choice whether you test for drugs or not. Can I address something else very quickly? And
Please.
that was touched on before about the acceptance of drugs by the Victorian public. I believe one of the reasons that marijuana in particular is accepted by maybe the majority of Victorians is because my generation has a memory of a product that is in an entirely different product to what there is today. And I'm not saying there was no harm in marijuana back then, but there's more harm in marijuana today. But most of the people of my age don't know that.
Okay,
I'd love to dive into that more, but the chair's already been very
We might
generous
move
with my
on to the
time, so
next,
thank you very much.
Rachel?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your submission and presenting before us today. I do want to raise just a little concern I do have, and I do take notion with this, that throughout this submission you've claimed that I've made false statements that are an offence to reason and truth, and that I have been misleading in my second reading speech. Now, as a former Member of Parliament, you know that we have a duty of care to present the absolute truth when we're in Parliament. We don't mislead the Parliament. And as an elected Member of Parliament, I take that incredibly seriously. And I want to take notice of this because the data that I have referenced in my second reading speech is from Crime Statistics Agency. It is from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. This is valid, evidence-based approach that I'm referring to here. And I also take notion that you make reference to the predominantly jurisdictions that are international throughout your submission. Now, what this bill aims to do is to look at the ACT. The bill is mirrored itself off the ACT legislation with some minor improvements, that's for sure. But I think we just have to draw it back to, we're not talking about a commercialised cannabis market here. What we're talking about is removing that criminalisation so that people do have less stigma and greater accessibility to health service provisions. So on that note, I would like to ask about your concerns that you talk about cannabis and the risk to First Nations people. Are you aware that First Nations people are 8 times more likely to be charged with a cannabis offence than non-Aboriginal people, and half as likely to get a caution? So ultimately, isn't it going to be a benefit to First Nations people's health to remove that criminalisation and encourage greater access to health care provisions?
What I would like to say to that is that the suffering of our First Nations people shakes me to the core. I could break down in this session as how much sorrow I have for their suffering. There is nothing, not one fibre in my being that I would want to do anything in any way to damage them in any way possible. We are so moved by the impact of drugs on the Indigenous people, on how it ravages families and how it leads to such abuse and transgression, how the preponderance of sexual assaults on babies as their nappies are ripped off them, the preponderance of women dying of incredibly brutal domestic violence, the sense of hopelessness in remote communities, people, about 40% of children attending school, all sorts of diseases rife. And this is aided and abetted not just by cannabis, but it's from glue sniffing and other forms of inhalants. We understand that it's not a total standalone cannabis problem, that they're sub, and of course what everybody knows and understands, the alcohol intake as well. Now, but what we do know is that cannabis directly impacts on the public health of our Indigenous people. And they must be protected from the advance of the criminal mindset that would be dealing and flogging it to them and making it available to them. So let's go back to first principles. It gives them heart and lung complaints. We already know that their lifespan is shorter. Sometimes people estimate something approaching 10 years of the lifespan of non-Indigenous people in this country. We see all sorts of impacts from drugs, and why on earth would we focus on the byproduct of them accessing a product, that is the whole contest of them being incarcerated, perhaps unjustly dealt with in the criminal justice system. If you go back to first principles, if you help them, you educate them, you say don't take this, and you get the means to support them away from that. And we also know that quite often, and all the evidence is out there, and I know Kel Blair can point to this, is that, and emphasise this, the simple thing is that Indigenous people may not have been arrested simply for possession or usage of cannabis. Nobody's after them for that. There's no history of that. It's that they might have been involved with an aggravated burglary, shoplifting, a driving offence, criminal levels of violence, any level of violence, the rape of a child under 3, a whole range of things.
The data
and
I'm
we
actually
put that in the soup.
The data I'm referring to is the Crime Statistics Agency data, and it is relative to 8 times more likely to be charged with just a cannabis offence. So I do want you to have that front of mind when you're thinking about how we best approach our First Peoples and policy making in that space.
Yes, well, let's all work together to save them and not add to their problem.
Can I address here, Chair? Incarceration is not a consequence of possessing a small amount of cannabis. I'll quote from the Fitzroy Legal Service. The offence of using a drug of dependence is a summary offence. I won't give the section. The use of cannabis or tetrahydrocannabinol carries a maximum penalty of up to 5 penalty units. There is no jail penalty even for subsequent offences. That's from the Fitzroy Legal
Well,
Service.
that's the Act says. Section 71 says that the maximum penalty is a fine. It can't be more than about $960, give or take a few cents. So people are not going to jail for mere possession, and it's not an offence that's really enforced with any vigour, because usually people picked up and charged with a cannabis offence do face other serious charges. Yes, they may be jailed, and if trafficking, of course, is different. But I don't understand why a substance that is obviously very important in the health of Aborigines, why we would simply make more of it available. That doesn't seem to me to be logical. I would have thought that we would have had programs to discourage their use of any substance that affects adversely on their health. And I'm all for that. We do not have enough programs that really look at the underlying issues faced by our Indigenous people and try to do something about that. That would be far more useful in my mind than simply making another product more freely available.
If I may
Thank you.
augment...
We might move to the next questions. Dr. Heath?
Thank you very much. I've just got a couple of questions for Dr. Broadley, if that's okay. I find it very interesting, the reviews that you've done. Is there any data that shows that the decriminalisation of cannabis results in harm reduction?
Sorry, your question is there any evidence to show that the decriminalisation of cannabis
Results in harm reduction?
No, I haven't looked a lot at decriminalisation. My focus has been on legalisation.
Okay.
There's a lot of research around legalisation of cannabis and the results. So that's where my focus has been.
Results in harm reduction then with legalisation?
Harm reduction? No.
Yeah. No. Okay.
No. The outcomes of legalisation and again, look, I've focused on overseas because that's where the systematic reviews are. I would look at Canberra, I would look at the ACT if there was a systematic review there. There is some research coming out, but there's not a lot, not enough to do a systematic review. But in terms of overseas jurisdictions, there's plenty of research, plenty of systematic reviews, and all of those reviews show that there is an increase in public health harms. So mental health harms and physical health harms. Also, there are questions around public safety. Certainly there's not a lot of evidence that would say that, for example, road accidents have increased, but certainly the researchers are saying, oh, there's a modest increase, one systematic review said. And so we're getting evidence from lots of places, from all over the place, and different authors and different types of research. That's the research you need to focus on. And I think in terms of, you know, the question that we were talking about before, there's a balance to be had. On the one hand, we're concerned about health and the public health harms, which are definitely there. But then we think about the criminal harms. Are we criminalising people? Are we locking people up? Are we putting people on community-based orders just for using cannabis? And the evidence there, I have to say, I'm very unconvinced that we're putting otherwise law-abiding, non-violent people in prison or even into the criminal justice system simply because they're using or possessing cannabis. I mean, I notice online, Mr. Eddershank, on your website, you say you're a long-term cannabis consumer. Now, that website is there for everyone to see, for me to read, the police to read, everyone to read. And yet you sit here today as a free man. So, you know, I wonder about that.
That's amazing logic.
It is.
Okay.
You've been using cannabis for a
40
long
years.
term, a long time, and people know that. And yet, you know, the police, are they knocking on your door? Are they doing raids? Are they searching you? Are they searching your car?
I have had that, yes.
Have to say yes, but you're still free. You're still
Right.
sitting here.
I should just wear it, you reckon?
What I'm saying is,
You're serving in the parliament.
No.
As you did.
What I'm saying is that I do believe it's an overstatement. I do believe it's an exaggeration to say there are all these people being criminalised merely because they're using cannabis. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
I think it's an overstatement. It's an exaggeration.
I've got an important point to make, and I'd really like to help
We're not
Rachel
going to run
Payne.
out of time, are we? 'Cause
Just
there's a few
Dr.
of us
Heaps
would love
asking a
to.
question at the moment. Thank you.
Question was, in the data, was there any evidence that showed that when adults in a home consume cannabis, that the children in that home were more likely to use?
There is evidence. Look, there's a concern by the American Paediatric Association around that, and that's why they do not support cannabis legalisation, because they're concerned because the evidence shows very, very clearly that there's an uptick in the use of cannabis once it's legalised. The logic then would say, well, then maybe parents will use more, children will be exposed to it, and then children, because of social modelling and modelling themselves off their parents, will use more. So there's certainly a concern there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Dr.
much.
Heath.
Cheers.
David?
Thank you, Chair. And it's lovely to see you again. Haven't seen you since the workplace inquiry. That was such fun.
I saw you at lunch before Christmas.
That's true. Well, I'm not sure where to start. I don't want to get into just the vast amount of sort of factual errors in your submission, because that would take up too much time.
There aren't any.
But let's just pick up a couple of points, I think. I'm not sure if you've looked at the terms of reference for this inquiry, but we're specifically looking at decriminalisation. And if I can take your comment, Dr. Broadley, that I haven't looked a lot at decriminalisation, I've looked at legalisation.
Correct.
And by legalisation, I think you're actually referring specifically to commercialisation, a la US and Canada. I would be correct in saying that? Okay, so let's maybe park that,
Yep.
okay, because it's really not what the committee's looking at, if that's all right. What we are looking at is basically a version of the ACT legislation. I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the review document that has been produced.
I've looked at that, and like I said, I also like to look at the peer-reviewed research.
You have looked at it. Maybe we just leave it at that, and I'll put the question, and
Sure.
you can answer to that.
Sure,
How's that?
sure.
So this review, which was analysing the first 4 years of the Act, and we now have 5 years of data, and this was a review undertaken by the ACT government involving a range of tertiary institutions, stakeholders, criminologists, the federal police, and it actually found no change whatsoever in terms of any of the things you've talked about, in terms of hospitalisations, any health indicators. This committee sat with the health minister for about an hour and went through this, and she said they go through their data monthly and they could find nothing. No ambulance changes, increases in that. Literally nothing changed except for the fact that convictions or infringements dropped by 96%. Does that sort of resonate with you?
It surprises me, and I'd be a lot happier if there was peer-reviewed research.
Well, it of course does actually draw on peer-reviewed evidence.
But
and of course we've also now got, last week, released by the Lambert Institute, peer-reviewed document that analyses both this document as well as the legislation, and it also came up with the same outcome.
Okay, so I'm talking about peer-reviewed research in relation to the ACT specifically,
That's
and
what I'm
also
referring to.
systematic reviews of that. What I'm saying is that time will tell. We need to have more than a couple of studies. We need to have a lot of studies, and time will tell. Because of what I've read about the situation overseas, and because of the amount of studies that have been conducted in relation to the overseas situation, I understand that legalisation and decriminalisation are very different, but still they both give out a similar message about cannabis use being safe, cannabis use not being a problem, cannabis use being okay.
Okay, let's stop there for a second, because I think that's a really important assumption. Central to what we're talking about is what's called, a health approach. Yeah.
Sorry, central to what we're talking about is?
Well, in terms of damage, right? You keep on referring to damage, and we won't go
Public
into the
health,
thousands of
harms,
Reader's Digest level analysis you've quoted.
I have to challenge that comment, Chair.
Okay.
That is terribly disparaging. We are talking about world-class authoritative research. That is a terrible, disparaging comment to make.
I withdraw my comment.
I'm asking it to be withdrawn.
It's already withdrawn, Ms. Kronberg.
Quick ask question.
Well, actually, I was actually sort of kind of looking for that, but yes. So, if we look then at a health promotion approach, right, which is central to what everyone's arguing is the way to go, rather than a criminal approach, because contrary to what Mr. Glare says, last year we actually jailed 400 people on personal possession in Victoria.
I'm not advocating jailing cannabis
That
users.
cannot happen.
Well,
for-
it actually
not
does. We've
for
actually had
possession,
multiple witnesses
not
to
for
I think
say.
that's a
possession of
fantasy.
small-
That is a
Well, it's
fantasy.
actually,
fantasy.
it is actually,
It's for a
sorry,
legal service.
it's actually, well, the legal service was here prior to your arrival, and they just talked about exactly that.
That's their document.
Can I come back to this point of a health-based approach and trying to address it? Because we know in Victoria that there's around 750,000 people that have used cannabis in the last 12 months. We know that we have a huge criminal enterprise worth about well over $1 billion a year. We know that there's about 2,000 tonnes of cannabis that's brought in. And I guess, and we can keep on looking at it, it costs us $300 or $400 million a year just in justice and policing costs. And I'm reading through your stuff here, and it's sort of like you're saying, just say no. It's like the Nancy Reagan approach to drug reform. Now, I guess I'd just like to know, in the context of moving this debate forward, when you say for example, Dr. Broadley, that because the vast majority of people think it's a good idea doesn't mean it is.
Yep.
And when we've got a situation where the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare over the last 15 years have been surveying the Australian community, and we've seen that support for decriminalisation has gone from 72% to 80%.
What's your evidence for that?
It's actually the Australian
Question.
Institute of Health and Welfare,
David, you-
National Drug Survey,
And who's paying for them and their research?
the Commonwealth
Mr.
Government.
Shanks, could you direct the question?
I was actually trying to before it was an interjection, Chair, but I'm just sort of wondering, like when we get to 80%, is that enough to maybe conclude that there might be broad public support for this change?
Fantasy.
And,
Look.
and that maybe it's called democracy?
Let me just bring in something that we haven't talked about,
Yeah.
medical cannabis. About 1 million people, I think, have accessed medical cannabis over the last few years.
Oh, that's 1 million scripts. I think it's about
A
300,000.
million?
Miss
A
Broadley,
million
answer the
scripts,
question.
sorry. 1 million scripts. And certainly the interest in medical cannabis is growing. It has grown and it is growing. And there certainly is research. There are researchers who would say, and many who would say, you know, they're concerned about that because there's only 2 that are approved by the TGA, 2 products, medical cannabis products. The rest, the other 500 or so, are generally what a lot of these people are getting scripts for. There's an idea that, you know, people, if it's decriminalised, if it's legalised, people can grow their own cannabis. They can grow their own plants. I think there's a real concern about that. I do think there's a concern that if it's decriminalised, more people will grow it, more people will use it, more people will use it for things like anxiety and stress and sleep disorders and a whole lot of things that are not actually, it's not actually approved for. And that would be a concern. And there's a whole lot of health organisations in Australia that have expressed concern about that, concern about the number of people accessing medical cannabis for and products that have not been approved by the TGA.
Thank you.
Chair,
Mr.
Chair,
Ayala,
may I make
next
2 quick,
questions?
may I make 2 quick
Yes, Mr.
points?
Yeah.
I
You saw to
understand
his
the
questions.
Canberra study didn't ask about how many children were using cannabis.
Well, actually, they
Place,
did.
actually.
There is actually. I'll just pick up that question.
And-
The study did exactly do that, and what
and-
it found was that over the 5 years, there was actually a measurable but not significant decline in the number of young people who were accessing cannabis. But I thank you for your question, sir.
It was, what percentage?
Oh, can I suggest,
just-
Chair,
no, thank you. Just
we'll provide a
your
copy
time.
of the
Thank
review
you.
to Mr.
You-
Blair, and he
you're
can read
nice.
it in his own time.
David?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, thanks, Chair. Thank you, everyone. Look, we are really tight for time for a variety of reasons. I might just start by stating, Chair, I think we need to seek a right of reply from numerous organisations that have been reflected upon today. So the police representatives we met in Canberra, I think they deserve a right of reply about their testing and the way in which they conducted that per the data that was referenced earlier. Also Fitzroy Legal Service, who we heard from earlier today, it seems to be representations made of them. I think they deserve to respond to those, perhaps in writing to the committee. Otherwise, though, I will send questions through in writing, just in the interests of time, so that you can give a fulsome response. And I'd like to cede the rest of my time to Mr. Eddershank, who I don't think was finished with his questioning.
That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that just to time, we've got another session coming, but so thank you much for coming in.
Chair, I'm just wondering if I can table something for the edification of the
to table
committee,
it.
please. First and foremost, I draw your attention to the legislative review of the Cannabis Act, the final report of the expert panel, dated Friday the 26th of March of 2024. It's the Canadian Legislative Review. So we see the Canadian government about to fall on the basis of legalising drugs.
On that issue alone.
If you just read the title and just...
Yeah. The other thing is the Canteen study from the Journal of Psychopharmacology, Cannabis Use Disorder.
Are they part of your submissions?
Yes,
They've all been under
they
reference in your
They
submission?
support our submission. The other thing is that, Charlie, have you got something here?
If they're all part of the submission, we already
Chair,
got them.
we're going to table these
Yeah.
books. There's a copy for everybody.
Would there be any chance I could ask one question, Mr. Eddershank?
Just a moment.
To be disabled, yes, sorry.
Sorry, just a quick question of Mr. Eddershank. On the basis that this is all about health and there's and it's about
Mr. Richard, we will take it on notice. You will submit those answers to Mr. Agashay.
very
We'll
quick
take the answer
question.
on notice, just to the
Why,
time.
why wouldn't it be all drugs? Why wouldn't it be all drugs on the basis of the argument you're putting forward?
Thank you.
I didn't expect the question, but
Just take the answer on notice.
Chair, if I might just make the point that we have gifted the committee a copy of this book. They actually retail for $35.95 each. We sell them on our website. And I want to say that this book is written by our co-founder, Elaine Walters, OAM. She got the OAM for this work. And this is probably one of the world's longest longitudinal studies. It represents 40 years of her work pushing back against the dangers of marijuana.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you. So
I
thank you
hope
for
we-
coming in
we
and
get
for
a
your
lot from that
submission
book, for
and
everybody.
your
Seriously,
contribution today.
no matter which part of the debate we're on, seriously, this is
Well,
an important
thank you very much.
reference.
Would ask the hands up to stop recording, please.